Calgary is just so vibrant. It's so exciting. The amount of green space, parks, regular festivals, the diversity of backgrounds and cultures here. It's just such a great place to live, and I have so much hope for the future of Calgary.
I believe in Calgary.
I believe in Calgary.
I believe in Calgary.
I believe in Calgary.
This is the We Believe in Calgary podcast.
We're here to give voice to the Zane Novak 2021 Mayoral Campaign by speaking to community leaders, local entrepreneurs, and civic visionaries about the issues and innovative ideas that affect Calgarians.
Join us every second Wednesday leading up to the municipal election on October 18th. Thank you for joining us again today on the We Believe in Calgary podcast. I'm here with my co-host and guest for today, Simon. So he's here today to talk about a seemingly dull topic, agriculture, but it's one that actually affects all human beings and is very important to Alberta's future, especially with our current economic uncertainty of oil and gas. So thanks again for joining us, Simon. You're on the hot seat this time, so it's a little different, but and as you know, the first question we always like to start off with is, what is your Calgary story?
Yeah, thanks, Cal. Looking forward to this conversation, and it's a nice change from the usual hosting duties. So, my Calgary story, it's not a long story, I guess. I moved to Calgary just over 4 years ago, so summer of 2017. I moved from Prince George, BC, a not very well-known city in northern British Columbia. And I moved here really just to get out of Prince George, I guess. And, growing up and spending 30 years in Prince George, I was looking for something different, and I wanted to continue my career, and Calgary seemed like, given the opportunity I had with the company I'm with now, obviously seemed like the best place to do that. So I moved here, and I think I had initially what was kind of a stereotypical view of Calgary and Alberta, not having spent a lot of time in Calgary and Alberta. I traveled a lot in BC. I traveled a lot in the United States, internationally, and I just never had a lot of interest in Alberta, I guess, and in Calgary. And a lot of the people I talked to growing up, people seemed to think Calgary was just a cowboy town, oil and gas town, jacked up trucks, etc. And, it didn't take long for me after moving here to realize how wrong I was and how wrong that stereotype is about Calgary. And I was very lucky, because not having done that research, I really didn't know what to expect. And it was a bit of a gamble on my part for that reason. I feel very fortunate to have found Calgary and made a home here. It's such a beautiful city, and the people here, the diversity, the green space on this podcast, the mountains, being close to Rocky Mountains comes up quite frequently. And it is just so far from, I think, what a lot of people, the box they put Calgary in. So I've been here for 4 years now, and I couldn't have asked for a better change. So, and I feel kind of settled in now, I guess, after these few years, and settled in with my career, settled in Calgary with the people here. And I guess that's my Calgary story. I'm still here. I'm still working. I've moved around a little bit in Calgary, lived in a few different locations, and I'm just so happy to be here. So,
well, listen, if it doesn't work out for you in agriculture, I think you could be a tourist or representative of Calgary, because that's probably one of the better Calgary stories I've heard on this podcast. Just promoting Calgary. So I'm very happy to hear that, and that you're planning on sticking around too. So I guess one question I had was, before we really jump into it, is what's your connection with agriculture?
Sure. So I studied biochemistry and molecular biology in university back in Prince George. My focus was on plant physiology. I actually grew medical cannabis for Health Canada, basically a subcontracting type position. Grew for a few patients in Prince George. So I have, I guess, an academic background in plants and plant production, and some practical experience working with plants, albeit in a very different context than how I work in the industry now. But yeah, I've always had a fascination with plants, with crops, and, I guess just a bit of a tangent, but I had planned to go to medical school. Biochemistry is a pretty common prerequisite for med school. And a few years into my degree program, I just wasn't ready for that career. It didn't feel right to me. So I focused more on the plant side, and my interest was already kind of there. So that's kind of where I ended up. And yeah, I work now for a commercial agricultural supplier, wholesaler. So I work supplying farm inputs, focusing on the horticultural side. So I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that.
Well, anyone who knows me knows that Simon kind of converted me over to the agricultural industry. It's not a very sexy topic to talk about, especially in Calgary or in Alberta with oil and gas, or basically any other industry. But I mean, it's such an important industry because we all need food to survive. It's something we've taken for granted. And so, in my conversations with Simon, it's just I've got an impression there's so much more to agriculture. And when people generally think about agriculture, they think of just farms, crops grown outdoors using tractors, cows, straw hats, that kind of thing. Do you mind elaborating on that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. And, I guess before I got knee deep in the industry, that was kind of my impression of it as well. Yeah, it isn't the sexiest of industries, but having spent 4 years now working in it, it is such a great industry. It is to me, it's so exciting. You mentioned kind of the importance of food security, and I derive a lot of I derive a lot of purpose from my career, and I feel really good about being a part of that industry and helping not only farmers put food on the plate, but also, help with the idea of local food production and really helping to progress the industry and progress the technology involved in the industry. And there is a lot of technology in the industry, I think, especially in the horticultural space, which is where I work. It's a little bit, I don't want to denigrate the traditional farmers, but I think it's a little bit more technical form of crop production. So yeah, there's so many different forms of crop and food production these days. And while grain and oilseed in the field is still the most common, actually it's 34%, I believe, of the total crop area in Canada. Animal agriculture, dairy, poultry and eggs, horticulture, viticulture, which is production of grapes for wine, aquaculture, which is fish and other forms of aquatic food. They're also very important for food security. So we also utilize plant production for non-food purposes. So landscaping, gardening, tree nurseries, medicinal plants. These days, we also cultivate commercial cannabis for recreational purposes. So that's a new and growing industry. We grow plants in indoor spaces, vertical farms, rooftop gardens, as well as many other modern applications I'm sure I'm neglecting to mention at the moment. But yeah, there's so much to it. And that's been one thing that I've found very exciting about it, and something that my position has allowed me to really explore. So the company I work for is a BC-based company. Most of our staff, most of our operations are in BC. I've kind of been essentially running what is my own small business while working for a company of over 100 people, just because I don't have a lot of local support and staff. We are growing in Alberta. TerraLink Horticulture is the company I work for. But really, I've been kind of doing my own thing out here, which is challenging for a lot of reasons, but it's also very rewarding. And yeah, for that reason, I've been able to kind of dabble and work with businesses of all different natures. So like some of the ones I mentioned previously, and that's been very interesting because obviously a tree nursery is very different than a garden center, which is very different than a golf course, which is very different than a cannabis greenhouse. And, there are obviously a lot of common themes and a lot of overlap there, but they're very different. And so I've got to learn a lot for that reason. In some sense, it's almost overwhelming. It has been a little bit overwhelming for me to try and be an expert in all these different fields and apply my knowledge to these various types of businesses. But my primary focus has been on vegetable production in the greenhouse, and that's kind of where I'm able to focus now more of my energy, especially as we're adding on new staff here in Alberta that can kind of tackle some of these other auxiliary industries. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at and where the industry is and kind of some of the different options out there.
So speaking of focusing and Alberta, and I've only recently found out that Alberta has about 2/3 the agricultural, I guess, land or production that Saskatchewan does, which is huge, considering that's mostly what Saskatchewan has. I mean, we have so many different things in Alberta, and like I mentioned before, oil and gas has always been the main focus. But with 2/3 and, with the uncertainty of oil and gas, the agricultural industry is looking a lot more appealing at this point. So what's the state of crop production and agriculture in specifically Alberta and Calgary in the area?
Great question. And while we're only maybe 2/3 of what Saskatchewan is, Alberta has the second most production in Canada. And so I think, Alberta and Saskatchewan is kind of known as the breadbasket of Canada. So between the two provinces, and anyone who's ever traveled to Saskatchewan knows that it's just a lot of farms. And yeah, so Alberta has a lot of animal ag as well. It's a big part of the industry in Alberta. But in general, farming has always been integral to the Canadian economy and to Canadians generally. Obviously, having a huge land mass, having significant arable land, we've been able to use a lot of this land to feed ourselves as well as to export these commodities to help feed the world. So Canada is, and I'll talk a bit more about Alberta specifically, but Canada, just to give some context, is the world's largest producer of rapeseed, which is a category of crops that includes canola and other plants for production of vegetable oils. We are the world's largest producer of dry peas, lentils. We are the second largest producer of oats. We're also leaders in soy, maize, potatoes, flax, etc. So yeah, there's a lot going on. And Alberta, like Saskatchewan, has a primary focus on cereal crops, they're called. So that's wheat, barley, rye, oats. Living in the prairies, I think anyone who's spent some time here would see a lot of the livestock, beef production. Hog and poultry farming is a huge economic force for Alberta. And it brings in billions of dollars to the economy with our exports. So while there's not a lot of fish farming, that sort of thing, obviously there's not a lot of water out here to do that sort of thing. That's kind of Alberta's focus, but it's really diversifying. And what I think we'll probably talk about at some point in this conversation is my focus, which is horticulture. And that is really just booming in Alberta right now. And traditionally we've been, I guess, kind of the third largest greenhouse producer in Canada. So southern Ontario is the largest. Leamington area, Lower Mainland in Vancouver area is second place, and then Alberta has always kind of been a distant third. But in recent years, and actually very recently, the last year or two, there's really been a big boom in the Alberta horticultural industry.
So before we jump into horticulture, because I do want to ask you about that, I was just going to ask you, do you know what the numbers are as a ratio, perhaps, as far as how much livestock farming is compared to crop and horticulture? Like, is there some sort of ratios, maybe, for example, like one-third livestock, one-third?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, grains and oil seeds are the biggest food crop in Canada in terms of agricultural commodities. So that's 34%. A close second would be red meat, livestock. That's 24%. Dairy production, and we're talking about Canada as a whole right now.
Okay.
So I don't know the specifics for Alberta. I'm sure these numbers would be skewed a little bit
Right.
towards, like I said, the cereal crops in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Dairy 12%, horticulture 9%, poultry and eggs 8%. So yeah, horticulture is a relatively small piece of that, but as I mentioned, it's growing, and I think a large part of that is, maybe COVID has contributed to this a little bit, but people, I think, are now thinking more about local and sustainable food production. So I don't know if a lot of people know this, but traditionally, a lot of our food crops, when you go to a grocery store and you buy, a 6-pack of bell peppers, historically, most of that has been imported from Mexico and elsewhere. So, California, obviously they have a much more suitable climate for crop production than Canada. They can grow year round. They have generally a warmer climate. So that allows for more production, cheaper production. Another component is labor. So in Mexico, and if you're a large agri company and you're looking to find a cheap place to grow food, Mexico makes sense. Labor is cheap.
Right.
Energy might be cheaper. And then it's just a matter, they're going to pay more to truck that food up to Canada. But at the end of the day, Canadian farmers are competing with imports from Mexico and the United States. So that's something that has been changing. And
you talked about technology. Is that kind of something that's helping us compete?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So we need the technology to be able to grow through the winter.
Right.
And yeah, we can talk about that. But yeah, I think it's I just find it exciting and very interesting that people, and I don't know to what extent this is true, but I think more and more people are maybe willing to pay a little bit more for that bell pepper, knowing that it was grown in Alberta versus grown in Mexico.
So you think some of this might have been spurred by the sort of the organic, I wouldn't say a movement, but just, the preference for people to get organic food?
I think so. Organic is, so organic's not huge in Alberta because getting organic certification is a challenge. But I think, I think you're right. It's kind of part and parcel with this idea of sustainable and local, right? It's a trend that's, I think it's been going on pre-COVID. I think COVID's maybe accelerated that a little bit. Yeah. But to your question about the technology, so that's something that allows for us to grow in what is objectively a pretty harsh climate.
Right.
So through the winter, and to be able to be efficient in our production. Nowadays, we're seeing more, I guess, robots in some of these high-tech greenhouses. It's been interesting for me and very fascinating because in some of these operations, I have to sign an NDA because there's trade secrets, there's technology in there, and just to kind of speak generally, there are some very high-tech greenhouses in Alberta, either for lettuce or for cannabis, which seemingly allow for more automation than other crops. You can walk into, say, a 20-acre facility. So I don't know how big that is in square feet, but it's a very large for a greenhouse. And it is just, crops as far as the eye can see, and there's no people. These are all, automated systems, robots, and LED lighting and controlled environment. And it's very, very interesting. I got to show you some pictures. Unfortunately, listeners won't be able to see this, but just it's very, very interesting. How far that's come, and I think some people might be opposed to that a little bit because they want to see people employed and working on these farms. Like I think there's a lot of similar to like self-checkouts at a grocery store. Some people just will never use a self-checkout because it's you're taking away jobs, et cetera, et cetera. In my mind, I think automation is, as long as it's not just making these rich companies richer and preventing maybe other people from gaining wealth, I think it helps being able to produce these commodities efficiently and at a low cost, allow that trickles down to the consumer.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, so it makes for when you go to the grocery store, you can buy a head of lettuce for cheaper, or if you go to a dispensary, I guess you can buy cannabis flower for cheaper. Right. So yeah.
So I know you signed an NDA, but in my head, I'm kind of picturing drones flying around. Do they have any of those at greenhouses?
Not in greenhouses, actually. So I don't work in the ag side, in the field crop side of things, but yes, absolutely, there are drone technologies now that are kind of working in conjunction with farmers. And you got to think, like, obviously there's a lot of benefit to getting a bird's eye view of these massive 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 acre broad acre farms. And now, and again, I don't know a lot about the specific technology, but it's very interesting to see how they're able to apply, say, like certain cameras or sensors to detect for disease, to detect for like nutrient deficiencies, and really just relay that information to the farmers and to other equipment. Wow. So now you're talking about automated drones, automated tractors that are communicating with each other to coordinate, a lot of these farm tasks. So yeah, and in the greenhouse, maybe an analogous technology would be like automated pickers. So when you grow, say, a cucumber plant, you grow them in these rows, these long rows, and this is not something I've seen personally. The technology, I think, is still developing, but these robots will go down the aisles and they will detect for disease. They will scan the plants for disease. They will pick the actual fruit. So yeah, that's definitely the future of crop production.
It sounds and feels like I just stepped out of a time machine, if I'm being honest. I didn't know this was all going on, and to this degree. I mean, I've seen things like vertical farms, which I always find really fascinating, how we can employ them, and especially in large urban centers. But this is something else. Just talking about, like I mentioned, farmland and the way we see things. Tractors and farmers and whatnot. So very fascinating.
Yeah. One of the leaders, I guess, we don't see a lot of this technology necessarily yet in Canada, but a lot of the more high tech production techniques come out of Holland. So Holland,
really?
Yeah, they've always been a leader, at least on the greenhouse side, with these technologies. So yeah, I think a lot of these innovations come out of Holland as well.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So you mentioned early TerraLink Horticulture. Is that just a division, or is TerraLink? Because I would assume they would have their hands in regular crops as well, like outdoor crops, or.
Yeah, we do to some extent. So TerraLink Horticulture is the name of the company. Our focus is horticulture, but as I mentioned earlier, we are really multifaceted, and we work with broadacre crops as well as all these other kind of subsets in the industry.
So to jump in a little bit about horticulture, can you explain to me and some of our listeners what exactly is horticulture? What's the focus of horticulture, and what kind of crops does it consist of?
Sure. So I guess the technical definition of horticulture is the practice of gardening, garden cultivation, and management. The horticulture industry is kind of known a little bit differently. It's known for, I guess, technical greenhouse crop production. So that includes fruit and vegetable crops, tree nurseries, ornamentals like bedding plants, now commercial cannabis. We also do supply like specialty ag products. We have an organic subsidiary. So yeah, a lot of different applications of horticulture. My focus is, like I said, kind of more on the fruit and vegetable side: tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, lettuce, eggplants, that sort of thing. They just are some of the best suited crops for growing in the greenhouse. So many broadacre farmers will also start their plants in a greenhouse.
Sorry, broadacre?
Broadacre is just all these large farms you'll see around Calgary and Alberta.
Okay. So it's just a general term for any kind of farm?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Any kind of outdoor field type production. Yeah. Okay. So they'll start propagate their plants in the greenhouse, and then they'll transplant into the field. It kind of allows them to get, I guess, a bit of a head start prior to the good weather, and gives these plants a bit of protection and I guess a healthier start, which is very, very important. So yeah, greenhouse crops consist of less than, as I mentioned, 10% of total agriculture in Canada. So it's a small industry, but it is growing, and it's really exciting. Southern Ontario has the largest concentration of greenhouses. So I said Leamington earlier. I got to check that area out a couple of years back, and it is massive. It is so much bigger than what I'm used to seeing in Alberta. And I think the reason for that is the proximity to the U.S. border. So they can get this food quickly on a truck and over the land border, and that's a big driving factor for the industry. It just allows for
this is Ontario or
Ontario, yeah, Southern Ontario, and essentially it is the most southern part of Canada. It actually kind of dips down a little bit below the border, the natural border of Canada, and yeah, the weather is kind of...
Is this around Niagara? Because I know they have a bunch of wineries. They're known for the wine around Niagara as well.
Niagara, exactly. That's that area. Lots of other outdoor crops as well in the Great Lakes area.
Being in southern Alberta, do we have any kind of similar geographical kind of trade? I mean, we're so close to the United States down here. We're like 3-4 hours at most. So I feel like...
Yes. Unfortunately, and again, so the reason why BC, again, has such a large industry, again, they have the weather, but also they are close to Washington, large population in Washington, whereas in Alberta, you have Medicine Hat Redcliffe, which is kind of the greenhouse capital of Alberta. But, if you drive south from there, you're going into Montana, and a lot of companies are doing this, but obviously there's just not a lot of big population centers in I guess that area of northwestern U.S. Montana.
So compared to BC and even Ontario, I'm just wondering, because I mean BC obviously has a better climate for maybe traditional crops, or sorry, like Broadview Broadacre. That's a housing company here. Broadacre farms, and I'm wondering, the one advantage do we have here is maybe sunshine compared to even Ontario.
Yes, and that's a good point. So Lower Mainland, while it's obviously a little bit more moderate climate, it's very cloudy, and so for that reason, Southern Alberta, as I mentioned, Redcliffe, it's kind of it's fairly ideal for that reason, because I think there's something like 330 days of sunshine a year in Medicine Hat. It is extremely sunny. So if you've traveled to that area of the province, it's very different than the Calgary area or the Edmonton area. It's kind of semi-desert, kind of arid, dry, very dry, hot, very, very hot summers. So that's why there's quite a concentration down there. Also, low energy costs. So kind of how this industry was initially created was, for over 100 years, the city of Medicine Hat has owned and operated its own power utility. And just natural gas was very, very affordable. So that, combined with all that natural sunlight, just made for an ideal place to build a greenhouse. That being said, there's a lot of challenges to growing in that area. They still get very cold in the winters, so that's you have to
insulation is probably huge.
Yeah, and exactly. So there's technologies that are used in the greenhouse to optimize for that, energy screens, and different ways that they can grow. A lot of growers that don't use lights will plant their crop in January, February. They grow all the way up until November, and then they pull their crop out, and they have 2 months of downtime during those 2 very cold months of the year, where energy costs are going to be much higher. Also, light levels are much lower, so it just makes sense to not be producing crops.
You were saying because of the oil and gas, they're able to provide energy, but I mean, with all the sunlight too, do you think solar is solar something they utilize?
Not yet. And it's interesting that you asked that question, because I had a fellow call me last week, and he's up in the Edmonton area, and traditionally there's not a lot of greenhouse industry in Edmonton and farther north for the reasons we just talked about. And there's a lot of kind of small retail home and garden, type mom and pop type operations. They grow in the spring, summer, and they shut down for 6 months of the year. But very little vegetable production, just because of those factors. I had a fellow call me up in Edmonton, and he's starting a relatively small vegetable greenhouse, and he is implementing some kind of solar technology. And I don't have much more information at this point, but it kind of piqued my interest because, like you said, as we progress with a lot of these renewable energy sources, there's an opportunity for us to kind of offset those high energy costs by using, so I grew up in northern British Columbia, Prince George. Very, very cold winters, but we get tons of sunlight.
Right.
Tons of sunlight. So, yeah, if you can harness that to heat or to power your lights, then yeah, why not?
Yeah, even if it's just a partial supply. I mean, running off total solar might be, inefficient or might be difficult to pull off. But so, I guess, what does a typical greenhouse look like? Do they use, UV lights or just natural sunlight?
Yeah. So, historically, kind of old-fashioned style greenhouses will be made from plastic, so poly houses. But really, greenhouses can vary so much in their setup and design. And this is something I didn't realize before I got into this industry. And I mentioned these kind of automated facilities. Now we see a lot of warehouse style facilities, so that's more common, I think, in cannabis, where black and gray market growers had to kind of hide their crop, so they would keep it indoors, right. And they would grow under lights and control the climate, which is a benefit to growing indoors. But yeah, I guess a traditional greenhouse is just a structure. A traditional greenhouse would just be a structure with usually 20 feet high roofs, so you have standard poly and that transmits as much light as is possible. Glass is ideal, lasts longer. Besides that, there's tons of variability in the technologies that they can implement. So I mentioned they'll have rows, so the crops are kind of grown in usually in a gutter. It's called gutter system. So this is just a racking essentially for the plants to sit on that gets them up off the ground. There's a crop wire that the plants will be stabilized by, usually with some kind of twine or string that provides support for these plants, because they're kind of, in some ways, they're kind of like mutant plants. They've been bred for production, and they put off so much fruit and vegetables that they can't really support themselves. So you kind of see that in poultry as well, right? Where these chickens are so big, they can't even support their own weight, because they got all these hormones, and they're just bred to be very heavy and grow really fast. Same concept with plants. So yeah, that's kind of the general type of setup. But yeah, it varies quite a bit nowadays. And what we were seeing in terms of these new builds and these new greenhouse projects is very high tech, very, very large greenhouses, glass with diffuse glass. So it kind of spreads out the light rays a bit so that they're less harsh. A lot of them now are, and actually Alberta is one of the leaders in lit crops. Even compared to Leamington, where you have thousands of acres of greenhouse production, Alberta actually is one of the leaders now, especially as these new greenhouses come online, in terms of lit production. So
what's lit mean?
Lit just means they have lights. So HPS usually. Now, again, going back to the technology, LED technology is becoming very big, and there's a lot of benefits to that. They don't put off as much heat. So yeah, and that allows one of the biggest benefits of growing a lit crop in a greenhouse is they can grow through the winter. And pricing, so for a farmer, if you're growing cucumbers in December, you're going to get better money for them than you are going to get for them
Right.
in August, because in August you're competing with field farmers who are
Right.
growing cucumbers outdoors for cheap, brings the pricing down. So using lights really enables growers to capitalize on that higher commodity pricing and grow all through the winter as well. So
Is there any kind of, I guess, competition between the broad acre farmers and a greenhouse grower? I mean, it seems like they'd be very different types of operations to the point where there could be some contention, because, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm assuming the broad acre farms still, just by volume and size alone, produce a lot more.
Yes.
And I'm sure down the road, or maybe when centers get more urban, more greenhouses are going to pop up. I'm just kind of curious as to this whole relationship between the two.
yeah, no, and it's a great question, because they are, like I mentioned, in the summer months they do compete, because I think the average person might not be able to tell the difference between a greenhouse tomato and a field tomato.
Yeah.
That's changing. I think people are looking more for quality than they are for a low priced product. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You can't. It's hard to compete with a field grower, a field farm, because they can produce at such a lower price. I'll give you a good example of how that's changing. So I think as of last year, all of the all the lettuce that you would get when you go to Wendy's would have been field lettuce. And that's still probably the case with most fast food restaurants. But as of last year, Whole Leaf, which is a high-tech lettuce facility down in Coaldale, close to Lethbridge,
Okay.
they got a contract for all of the Wendy's restaurants in Canada. So and a lot of that is marketing, right? So they are able to, and next time you go through the drive-through, you'll notice greenhouse grown lettuce on the menu. So they might be paying a slightly higher price point for that lettuce than they would be if they were buying field lettuce.
Just a quick question. So when you say it's greenhouse grown, it's like a point of pride or point of marketing, not
Yes.
because they're forced to write that down. It's because it's
It's totally a
an
marketing thing.
advantage.
So and I think kind of going back to what we were talking about before, people are, I think, more willing to pay a slightly higher price point for something that is definitely higher quality. And so and that is a difference. There is, having that protected environment, which a greenhouse provides, you do produce a higher quality product. So there is a difference between a greenhouse grown tomato and a field tomato. They do taste better.
Well, from a business point of view, I'm assuming that Wendy's would love to have their food grown in a greenhouse, because it helps tighten, I guess, their lines of production. I'm assuming by growing things in a greenhouse, everything is a lot more
Uniform.
consistent, uniform.
Absolutely. No, that's a good point. That's very true. And so and these restaurants, obviously, they are very particular about the products that they put into their burgers and their menu items. And yeah, it's very interesting, because when you get down to it, the nitty gritty, I'm sure in the Wendy's board meetings, they're talking about, well, this one has a bit more crunch, but this one has the right shape for the burger. And all these we as consumers, we don't really think about that, right? It's just it's a burger or whatever. Yeah. But no, every single minute little detail they are factoring in, and then they're comparing that to the cost and the price that they can then sell that product for. So
right. Just before we move on, I really wanted to go back to your comment earlier about how the gray and black market cannabis sellers kind of drove maybe they utilized UV technology and grew because they had to grow underground, sometimes quite literally. I'm kind of curious, in the way that war drives technology, or pornography has driven the technology world forward as well. Was the cannabis industry at all kind of instrumental in pushing some of these new technologies out? Because they're forced to innovate when you're doing things under the radar.
Yes and no. I'd say more no than yes, though. So cannabis is such an interesting thing, and we could, I think we could devote a whole episode to the history of cannabis in Canada. I have a personal background in that industry, in the medical side, and I find just the progression of the industry and kind of the story of cannabis and kind of where we are now to be just fascinating and a little bit depressing, to be honest, just given where we ended up. So yeah, we could talk about that. I'll try and be brief, but essentially, obviously crop production and farming has been around for hundreds of years, right? So, and throughout that period, cannabis has kind of existed on its own. It's as an outsider, and it occupied a very different space. Canada's a bit unique in that we've kind of there's been slightly more open and accepting of cannabis. But really, these technologies have existed forever. And so the way I look at it, and the way I think people who are experienced and knowledgeable in the industry look at it, is understanding how to grow a crop is very, very complex. And someone who knows how to grow a crop can learn how to grow a different segment or a different variety or a different type of plant. So what kind of happened with cannabis was when it came out of the shadows, I guess, of being a really frowned upon black market type of industry, a lot of you had all these kind of basement growers, these guys who they thought they were experts, and when cannabis became commercial and became legitimate, they thought that they could kind of reinvent the wheel in a sense, in terms of taking all these old cannabis trade secrets and old wives' tales and really not scientific based. I mean, some of it is valid to give them some credit, and then kind of scaling up these basement grow type systems. And I found it as someone, and I think I have a bit of a unique vantage point here because I had that background. And for me, seeing I spent a couple years in the legitimate crop production space while the cannabis side of things was coming online. And so for me, it was very interesting and almost comical in some ways to see these cannabis growers think that they just knew best. They knew how to do it better than anyone, and they built these. And to their credit, no one had done it before. No one had grown cannabis in the world. No one had grown cannabis in a legitimate commercial space before. So there was going to be a learning curve inevitably, but the ego and I guess just the kind of stoner hippie mentality really didn't do them any good. So the systems that were built were kind of a laughingstock. And a lot of these facilities now that have come and gone and failed because they were completely out to lunch in the way that they designed these facilities have not worked. And, a couple of years ago, I was trying to make this brief, but I'm just lots to talk about. But a couple of years ago, it was very interesting because there was kind of two breeds of cannabis growers. And these companies, when they hired growers to run these cannabis facilities, they would hire either the best of the cannabis world that hadn't ever grown commercial crops, or the best of the commercial growers that had never grown cannabis crops. Okay. And in my mind, I was betting on the commercial growers, these guys who had grown flowers in a greenhouse. Okay, didn't know anything about cannabis, but they knew how to operate a 30-acre facility and run a staff in that type of facility, and then just have to learn the new crop. And I was correct in the sense, and again, there were a lot of guys in the traditional cannabis world who were successful. They learned in the same way I learned the hard way. They had to figure it all out, and they did well because they
adapted, I'm assuming.
They adapted, and they
embraced progress.
And the ones who were open to new ideas rather than, no, this is how we're going to do it, this is how I've always done it, they didn't do well.
I'm almost wondering if it's part of the reason was because it was previously a black market activity. There was less communications. You can't openly go to a convention that you would normally
100%.
go to and share information. And you have to find some, weird channels.
Yes, and there was a frustration for me as a grower. You have to go on these blogs online. It's a bunch of stoners they are not technical people, they're not science-based people, telling you this and telling you that, and then you go into a hydroponics store and you talk to the owner of this hydroponics store, and I'm speaking from personal experience here.
Okay.
And they tell you, oh, do this because I know this guy who did it this way, and then they'll tell you something that's completely contradictory, and it's like, well, no, that can't be true because I know the science does not validate that idea.
Right.
So it was just very inconsistent information, like you said, and very frustrating for someone who was trying to figure out how to do it effectively to produce for the patients I was growing for. So
right.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a steep learning curve for the industry, and just, I guess, to fast forward to where we are today, just to kind of summarize, it's really been disappointing to see what has happened to the cannabis industry in Canada, because a couple years ago, when cannabis was first legalized, as I'm sure most people know, there was so much hype around the industry. There was all this excitement. There was so much investment. A lot of people made a lot of money investing in these companies, the smart ones who got out at the peak.
Yeah.
And one example that I think really encapsulates the general state of the cannabis industry today, I'm sorry to call out this one particular company, but there's a greenhouse now in Medicine Hat, and this is all public knowledge. So $200 million invested in what is a beautiful facility. $200 million for a 40-acre greenhouse is way too much money. So it was custom built, special design greenhouse built by Aurora Cannabis.
That's what I was going to ask of this company.
Yeah, it's an an Alberta-based company that they built this facility in Medicine Hat, and it's sitting empty right now. It's not even finished, and no one will buy it.
Seriously.
No one will buy this facility because it costs more to retrofit this facility for any other type of crop than it would be for a grower just to build their own brand new greenhouse.
Jeez.
Of the similar specs. So it's kind of like a tribute to that giant waste, and to what I believe could have been such a benefit to the Canadian economy. We were the first G7 country to legalize recreational cannabis.
Right.
And we could have been and should have been, in my opinion, a world leader. But it's almost like you want to stay with something that's a new innovation or a new industry. You almost want to be a second or a third. You want to let the leader make their mistakes, and you can learn from them, and then the tallest tree catches the most wind type idea, right? And that's the case. We've fallen behind now, and you watch when the United States legalizes it, which I'm sure they will in the next 5 years. Yeah, they have the infrastructure they've already, even without legalizing, they've already essentially surpassed us, or are about to, I would say, in terms of GDP and just the potential they have with the infrastructure they have.
Talking about cannabis GDP, or?
Yes.
Jeez.
Because all these states, right, they've legalized statewide,
right,
or they've legalized, most of them now have legalized medicinally.
Yeah.
And a lot of these people, the talent now, have left Canada because the industry was it's been a roller coaster. It was going to be huge. Everyone was interested. Everyone was talking about cannabis. No one talks about cannabis anymore in Canada.
I was going to say, so when you brought up Aurora was such a buzzword a couple years ago. Everyone was talking about stocks in Aurora, blah, blah, blah. You're right. It's completely disappointing to hear that you have this giant facility that's incomplete. And yeah, it's not a buzzword anymore. So, well.
Yeah, it's a shame. And a large part of that is the blame goes on the industry. These companies, they built too big too fast.
Yeah.
But also a large part of the blame, in my opinion, goes to Health Canada and the federal government for over-regulating. They created this industry,
right,
but then they regulated it to death. Almost.
I do know a few people in different parts, a lot of in retail, and I've heard of some of the difficulty. But like you mentioned, we probably should dedicate a separate episode to cannabis, and to draw it back to, I guess, the point of the podcast is Calgary and Alberta to a lot of the extent. cannabis was a form of diversification for Alberta, for Calgary, and your industry, and in a more positive note, your industry provides a lot of diversification for Alberta. Please tell me more about how and what kind of projects we have going on with the agriculture, the technology in Alberta.
Absolutely. And and cannabis still does represent some small portion of that in Calgary and the rest of Alberta and Canada. But one good example of Alberta embracing diversification through agriculture would be a project in Lacombe, where an oil and gas company has become a major stakeholder in a vegetable greenhouse operation. And this business is called Doof's Greenhouses. They're traditionally a vegetable producing operation. They're currently expanding their operations, building 26 acres of high-tech pepper greenhouses in the Lacombe area. And what is interesting about that is, so cogeneration is an example of how oil and gas, or essentially just using these hydrocarbon products to make greenhouse production more efficient. So what they do, cogens, they generate electricity, heat, and CO2, and essentially that would be otherwise wasted, and they use that to help heat the greenhouse, and plants feed off CO2, so they feed that CO2 into the greenhouses. So it's really like a match made in heaven in that sense. And so that's been around for a while, cogenerators on greenhouse properties, but this is a bit of a unique case because this company is actually, I believe, part owner of the company. To what extent, I'm not sure, but they're right. And Jason Kenney was out on site at Doof's, I think last year, talking about how, it really highlights, or it's a good example of that Alberta innovative spirit, where I think everyone can acknowledge that oil and gas isn't what it used to be, and I came to Alberta and Calgary a little bit after that boom, kind of in the decline, but I find it so interesting to see these oil and gas companies now partnering in the greenhouse space and the crop production space to just it's just a win-win for everyone. Yeah. So
I've heard of a few instances myself of similar, I guess, innovative partnerships or between industries, and one of them was bit farming as well, Bitcoin farming.
Yeah, sorry, just to jump in. It's interesting you mentioned that because apparently on that same site, there's going to be a Bitcoin mining company moving in and using some of that waste electricity as well. So yeah, it gets me excited about the future of Alberta.
So is that almost like a second life for these oil and gas productions? Could it be? Oil and gas is in everything we use. Petroleum products is in almost everything that we have. It's not quite as simple as just powering our cars. Is this perhaps, I know we're just small little pawns in this whole infrastructure, but do you think maybe that could be something that we could really move towards, even the larger companies?
Why not, right? Yeah, we have the technology, we have the land. So, as we were talking about before, there's really a demand for local produce. So these greenhouse expansion projects that I've mentioned, they're responding to consumer demand. Their retailers are asking for Alberta produce. Right. A lot of these greenhouses and these marketing companies, they distribute their product only in the prairies. That's not being exported to the United States, even into BC for the most part. So yeah, the sky's the limit in my opinion. And yeah, I'm excited to be a part of the industry and to see it grow.
Well, Simon, we could talk about this forever. I know we're kind of coming to an end here as far as time. And thanks again for explaining all of this to me. I know this is not the most interesting topic to a lot of people, but as I've talked to you more and more about, agriculture and the importance, and like you've been discussing all the technology that really goes into it, I find myself more and more drawn to it. And yeah, so thanks for sharing your story. As usual, we also like to ask the question to cap things off. Why do you believe in Calgary?
Kind of what I mentioned before, I came to Alberta with a very open mind. And after 4 years, I really feel to my core that I am so lucky to have found Calgary. Mm-hmm. And of course, being close to the mountains, personally, not having been here through the boom of the oil and gas period and arriving kind of after the fact, I still have just been constantly struck by the beauty of the city, and even more so the people of the city. And post-energy boom or not, Calgary is just so vibrant. It's so exciting. The amount of green space, parks, regular festivals, the diversity of backgrounds and cultures here. It's just such a great place to live, and I have so much hope for the future of Calgary. And I should also mention, it's the reason why I support Zane Novak for mayor. It's the reason why I'm doing this podcast, because, you know, in my conversations with Zane on this podcast and elsewhere, I know he feels the same way about Calgary. And I know he will fight to keep the city vibrant and to maintain many of these things that I find to be so amazing about the city.
Well, thanks again, Simon. It was a blast actually talking to you and interviewing you rather than having you co-host. Check us out next week or in 2 weeks when we have our next guest. Thanks again, Simon.
Thanks, Cal. Thanks for the opportunity.